The sun was sinking low behind the jagged hills of Red Creek, casting long, dusty shadows across the main street. Heat still clung to the earth like a stubborn ghost, and the air smelled of sweat, leather, and old whiskey. A lone tumbleweed rolled lazily past the wooden hitching posts, bumping against a half-rotted barrel before the wind carried it farther down the street. Inside the Silver Spur Saloon, the air was different, thicker, heavier, reeking of cigar, smoke, spilled ale, and desperation. The old piano in the corner had gone silent, its ivory keys stained yellow from years of neglect. A crowd of rough-looking men filled the room, faces lit by lamplight and a greedy gleam in their eyes. 5 young women stood on a small makeshift platform at the front of the saloon, their wrists bound loosely with rope. They weren't dressed like saloon girls, nor like women who belonged in a place like this. Their clothes, simple traveling dresses, now wrinkled and dusty, told another story. They were mail-order brides, women who had left their homes and crossed hundreds of miles in search of love, stability, and a new life. But tonight, those dreams had been stolen from them. The youngest Josie couldn't have been more than 18. Her dark curls framed a pale, tear-streaked face, and she clung tightly to Hannah's arm. Hannah, a tall, auburn-haired woman with sharp, proud features, tried to stay calm, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Don't you cry, Josie. Someone's bound to help us." "Someone will." Beside them stood Clara, the eldest of the 5, perhaps in her late 20s. She had the steady, measured look of a woman who'd seen hardship before, but never surrendered to it. Her gray eyes scanned the saloon, calculating, measuring each man, each exit, each possibility of escape, and finding none. On Clara's other side stood Margaret, a shy, gentle soul whose soft blonde hair fell loose from its pins. She kept her gaze on the floor, her hands trembling as though she could vanish into the wooden planks if she tried hard enough. Finally, there was Abigail, a fiery brunette with a stubborn chin and a glare sharp enough to cut glass. She had been the loudest on the ride into town, threatening every man who laid a hand on her. But even her courage faltered now. Faced with the grim reality of what awaited them, at the center of it all stood Jed Crowley, the owner of the Silver Spur and the architect of this cruelty. A squat man with a greasy mustache and a vest that strained over his bulging belly, Crowley wiped sweat from his forehead as he addressed the eager crowd. "Gentlemen," he drawled, his voice like gravel dragged across steel, "you're looking at 5 fine women, young, healthy, and ready to start families. But tonight, they ain't free. Tonight, you're gonna bid for 'em." Laughter rippled through the saloon, cruel and sharp, like knives scraping against bone. Josie whimpered, and Hannah pulled her close. Clara whispered for the others to stay quiet, but Abigail spat at the floor in front of Crowley. "We ain't cattle, you son of a—" Her words were cut off by a backhanded slap from one of Crowley's hired guns, a scar-faced brute who stood guard by the platform. The sound cracked through the room, and silence followed for a heartbeat. Crowley grinned, revealing crooked yellow teeth. "That there's just to remind y'all," he said to the brides, "you ain't got no say in this. None at all." He turned back to the crowd, his voice booming louder now. "Bidding starts at $50. A ranch hand in the front raised his hand immediately, and the bidding began. The room came alive with shouts and raised voices, men clamoring over one another like wolves fighting for scraps of meat. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Each shout, each number called out, felt like a hammer striking against her chest. She thought of her father's farm back east, the letters she'd received from a widowed merchant promising a kind home and children of her own. She thought of the train ride, the dusty stagecoach, the hopeful dreams she'd carried with her across endless miles. And now, standing here under the smoke-stained ceiling of the Silver Spur, she realized none of it had been real. Beside her, Josie's quiet sobs turned to muffled gasps, and Clara squeezed her hand tighter. "Don't you give up, Josie," she whispered fiercely. "We're going to get out of this. I swear it." Hannah's voice was low, almost a prayer. "Lord above, send someone. Anyone." From behind the saloon swinging doors, the sound of boots echoed faintly, slow, and measured. No one inside noticed at first. The chaos of shouting and bidding drowned out everything. But then another sound rose above the din, the low, ominous creak of leather as someone tightened the reins on Fate. Out in the street, Ethan Cole sat atop his black stallion, his hat pulled low against the setting sun. His jaw was tight, his expression carved in stone as he watched the light spilling from the Silver Spur's windows. The rumors he'd heard at the general store were true. Jed Crowley was selling off brides. Ethan's gloved hand rested on the butt of his Colt, and his heart beat slow and steady, like the ticking of a clock before midnight. Inside, Crowley barked over the shouts, $100. "Do I hear 120? Josie cried harder. Abigail cursed under her breath. Hannah whispered another prayer, and Clara, standing tall despite the ropes around her wrists, lifted her chin and stared straight ahead, refusing to let them see her fear. Farther back in the shadows, a drunk rancher muttered, "Ain't no lawman gonna stop this." But that night, Red Creek didn't need a lawman. It needed. The wind had begun to rise as dusk crept over the plains, carrying with it the heavy scent of rain and dust. Out on the lonely trail leading into Red Creek, a single rider moved at an unhurried pace, his black stallion's hooves striking a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Ethan Cole rode like a man carved from the very land itself, tall in the saddle, shoulders broad beneath his worn duster, his dark hat pulled low to shield his pale blue eyes from the fading sun. His face bore the marks of a life hard lived. A faint scar traced the edge of his jaw, and deep lines sat etched around his mouth, carved there by years of silence, solitude, and loss. 3 years ago, Ethan had buried his young wife beneath the lone oak tree on his ranch. Since that day, he'd lived like a ghost among the living. His ranch, Cole's Hollow, stretched wide and wild across the prairie. But to Ethan it had felt empty, a graveyard of dreams. He rarely rode into town unless it was for supplies, and even then, he kept his head down, spoke little, and avoided the noise of saloons and crowds. But today was different. He'd been in Granger's general store earlier that afternoon, picking up flour and coffee, when 2 cowhands started talking by the counter. Their voices carried, low and amused, but the words had hit Ethan like a strike of lightning. 5 mail-order brides. "Crowley's got 'em at the Silver Spur. Says he's selling 'em off tonight." The second man had laughed. "Poor little things don't know what's coming. Ain't nobody in Red Creek gonna stop Jed Crowley. Sheriff's been in his pocket for years." Ethan hadn't spoken. He'd finished his purchase, tipped his hat to the storekeeper, and walked out without a word. But inside something shifted. For years Ethan had kept to himself, shutting out the world and its ugliness. But there were some things a man couldn't ignore, not if he wanted to sleep at night. His wife, Mary, had been promised to him under similar circumstances, coming west after answering an ad for a husband. He'd seen what loneliness could do to a woman, how it made her vulnerable to liars and predators. He'd sworn to protect her, and though Mary was gone, Ethan still carried that vow like a brand burned into his soul. Now 5 young women were about to be sold like cattle, and no one was going to stop it. Except him. As he neared the edge of town, Red Creek lay quiet beneath the copper glow of sunset. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few boys running after a stray dog and an old man sitting outside the barber's shop, whittling wood with slow, careful strokes. but from the center of town came the low, muffled roar of voices, the Silver Spur Saloon. Its windows glowed like embers in the fading light, and drunken shouts and laughter spilled into the Fay Street. The sight made Ethan's jaw clench. He dismounted outside the blacksmith shop, tying his stallion to a post and giving the animal's neck a firm pat. The horse snorted, sensing his rider's tension. Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat, checked the bullets in his Colt, and brushed a hand across the polished stock of the Winchester rifle strapped to his saddle. He didn't want trouble, not if he could avoid it. But Crowley wasn't the kind of man who gave anyone a choice. Inside the Silver Spur, the auction was heating up. $150. Crowley shouted, his greasy face slick with sweat. Who'll give me $200? The crowd erupted with jeers and laughter. Somewhere in the back, a fight broke out between two drunken ranch hands, but Crowley's hired guns shoved them aside to keep the bidding going. On the platform, Clara's shoulders remained squared, though her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Josie clung to her arm, trembling like a leaf, and Margaret wept silently, her tears carving pale tracks down her dusty cheeks. Hannah's lips moved in silent prayer, while Abigail glared at every man who dared raise a hand to bid on them, her jaw tight with unspoken rage. Suddenly, Josie gasped, her tearful eyes widening. "Clara," she whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "Someone's comin'." Clara glanced toward the saloon doors. The muffled roar of voices faltered for just a moment as the sound of boots striking the boardwalk outside echoed through the saloon like distant thunder. Slow, measured, deliberate. Crowley paused mid-sentence, narrowing his beady eyes toward the entrance. His hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in the air. Even the drunkest cowhens straightened in their seats. Outside, Ethan climbed the saloon steps and stopped before the double doors, his hand resting lightly on the worn wood. The voices inside were muffled, but he could hear enough. Men shouting bids, the hollow laugh of Crowley, and beneath it all, the faint, broken sobs of terrified women. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He thought of Mary. He thought of the day he'd promised her she'd never know harm so long as he lived. And though he had failed her once, he would not fail these women. With one sharp kick, Ethan threw open the saloon doors. They slammed against the walls with a crack like lightning, and the crowd turned as one to face him. He stepped inside, boots thudding against the warped floorboards, his shadow stretching long beneath the lamplight. Dust swirled in the wake of his entrance, catching the light like flecks of gold. In his pale blue eyes burned a cold fire. Jed Crowley's lips twisted into a sneer. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it ain't Ethan Cole, come to buy yourself a bride?" The crowd chuckled uneasily. Ethan's gaze swept across the platform where the five brides stood, their faces pale and frightened, then back to Crowley. "This auction," he said, his voice low and steady, "is over." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Crowley laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "You got no say here, Cole. Sheriff don't run this town, I do." Ethan didn't blink. "Then you got a problem." The air grew thick, heavy, electric. Crowley's men shifted uneasily, hands hovering over their holsters. The brides stared at Ethan as if he were some avenging angel sent down from heaven, and somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He wasn't just a lonely rancher anymore. Tonight he was a reckoning. Storm had arrived. The Silver Spur Saloon was alive with noise, heat, and greed. The hanging oil lamps cast a dim amber glow across the crowded room, their flames flickering against smoke-stained walls. Men shouted over each other, boots stomping against warped Floorboards, fists pounding on tables as the bidding war for the mail-order brides raged hotter than a midsummer wildfire. $200. A cattle baron hollered, slamming his palm against the bar. $250. Another shouted from the back, half drunk but determined. Jed Crowley stood on the small stage, his greasy vest damp with sweat, grinning like the devil himself as he barked for higher bids. Beside him, the 5 terrified brides clung to one another, their faces pale under the flickering lamplight. Clara stood tall despite her pounding heart, gray eyes defiant and unyielding. Beside her, Josie's tears glimmered, silent streams down her cheeks as she clung to Hannah's hand. Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the floor, whispering prayers under her breath, while Abigail's jaw was clenched tight, fury burning. In her sharp green eyes, Crowley raised a fat, ring-covered hand for silence, his voice booming above the din. "Gentlemen, you're bidding on the finest stock this side of the Mississippi. Don't be shy now. Step up and claim yourself. A wife!" The words dripped like venom, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Then everything changed. Outside, Ethan Cole stood in the gathering dusk, boots planted on the creaking boardwalk, hat pulled low against the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows. The low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains as storm clouds gathered overhead. The faint smell of rain mixed with the dusty wind, curling around Ethan like a warning. He paused for a heartbeat, his gloved hand resting on the worn handle of his Colt. Through the swinging doors, he could hear the muffled roar of men shouting and laughing, the clink of whiskey glasses, and beneath it all, the faintest sound, soft, broken sobs. He thought of Mary, his wife, long buried beneath the oak tree on his ranch. He thought of the promises he'd made to her, the protection he'd sworn, the vow to never let another soul suffer like she had, and something deep inside him, something long silent, stirred awake. Without another thought, Ethan took a single measured step forward. Then another. The boards beneath his boots groaned softly. Inside the silver spur, the noise faltered just slightly, as if the crowd sensed a change in the wind. Then, with one sudden thunderous kick, Ethan slammed open the double doors. They crashed against the walls, rattling glass and bottles along the shelves. Dust exploded into the lamplight, swirling around his silhouette like smoke around a gun barrel. For a moment, no one moved. Ethan Cole stood framed in the doorway, broad-shouldered and silent, the storm wind curling at his back. The brim of his had shadowed his pale blue eyes, but even from across the room, the fire burning there was unmistakable. A hush fell over the saloon. The only sounds were the faint creak of a rocking chair somewhere upstairs and the slow, steady ticking of the clock behind the bar. Jed Crowley's grin faltered. Well, well, he drawled, forcing a laugh he didn't feel. If it ain't Ethan Cole. Thought you'd given up on people. Cole. Thought you'd rather die out there on your lonely ranch than step foot in my saloon. Ethan's voice was quiet, steady as stone. Let him go, Crowley. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. A few men shifted in their seats. Others muttered under their breath, sensing the danger in Ethan's tone. Crowley's laughter came louder now, hollow and sharp. Now why would I do a fool thing like that? He sneered. These ladies are mine. They came west for husbands, and I aim to give them exactly what they came for. Ethan's hand hovered near his Colt, fingers relaxed but ready. His eyes locked on Crowley, cold and unblinking. This auction's over. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then, a scar-faced thug at Crowley's right spat tobacco juice onto the floor and stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Ain't your say, Cole. You best turn around for someone puts you in the ground. Ethan's pale eyes flicked to the man, calm as a winter lake. Don't. The thug hesitated, just for a breath, then went for his gun. The sound of Ethan's Colt clearing leather was like lightning tearing through a summer sky. One sharp crack split the air and the thug dropped, his revolver clattering harmlessly across the floorboards. For a long heartbeat, no one moved, then the room erupted. Men dove for cover, overturning tables and shattering whiskey bottles as they scrambled for their weapons. Crowley's hired guns fanned out, their boots pounding against the floor. Bullets splintered wood, ricocheting off the bar and the staircase railing. Ethan dove behind an overturned poker table, his Winchester in hand now, loading it smooth and fast as a lifetime of practice took over. He fired once, twice, taking down two of Crowley's men before they could flank him. The bride screamed, ducking low behind barrels and crates at the edge of the stage. Clara shielded Josie with her body, whispering frantically for her to stay down. Abigail grabbed a broken whiskey bottle, ready to fight anyone who came near them. Over the chaos, Crowley's voice bellowed like a wounded bull. "Kill him! Kill the bastard!" A bullet tore through the brim of Ethan's hat, grazing his temple. He didn't flinch, his focus razor sharp. Sliding across the floor, he tipped the table upright and used it as cover, firing quick, efficient shots that drove Crowley's men back step by step. Hannah spotted one of the thugs creeping toward them from the side and screamed. Ethan turned just in time, firing a clean shot that sent the man sprawling. The saloon was chaos, smoke thick in the air, lamps swaying wildly, glass shattering, and boots pounding against the wooden floor. Every shot cracked like thunder, and every breath carried the coppery tang of blood and gunpowder. Through it all, Ethan moved like a man possessed, his silence more terrifying than any shouted threat. One by one, Crowley's men fell or fled, until only Crowley himself remained. Crowley grabbed Clara by the arm, yanking her upright, pressing the cold barrel of a pistol against her temple. "Drop it, Cole," he roared, his voice wild and ragged, "or she dies right here." Clara gasped, her gray eyes locking with Ethan's across the room. Ethan froze, every muscle coiled like a spring. He lowered his rifle slowly but didn't set it down just yet. "Let her go, Jed." Crowley's breath came in harsh, uneven gasps. Sweat ran down his face as he pressed the gun harder against Clara's head. "Ain't gonna happen, Cole. You walk out that door and maybe the girl lives. Otherwise, she's gone." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The bride stared wide-eyed. The crowd, what remained of it, crouched behind tables, too scared to move. Even the storm outside paused, thunder rumbling low and distant. Then Ethan's voice cut through the silence, quiet and deadly. "You ain't fast enough, Jed." Crowley's eyes flickered, just for a second, and that was all it took. Ethan drew and fired in one fluid motion, the shot ringing out like judgment itself. Crowley stumbled backward, the pistol slipping from his hand, his mouth opening in a silent gasp before he collapsed in a heap. Clara staggered free, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The saloon fell silent, save for the soft patter of rain beginning to fall outside. Ethan lowered his Colt, his jaw tight, his pale blue eyes scanning the room one last time. Crowley's men were gone, scattered like leaves before a gale. He turned to the 5 brides, still huddled together behind the barrels. Clara met his gaze, her voice shaking but steady enough to speak. "Why? Why'd you come?" Ethan holstered his Colt, his voice low. "Couldn't stand by and let it happen." Outside, the first flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating Red Creek and stark, silver light. Inside the silver spur, amidst shattered glass and splintered wood, 5 women stared at the stranger, who had walked into hell for them. None of them knew it yet. The night in Willow Creek carried a thick silence. broken only by the distant rustle of dry prairie grass and the faint cry of a lone coyote under the pale, silver glow of the moon. The air was heavy with the promise of an approaching storm, though no rain clouds stirred above. Inside the Rusty Spur Saloon, however, the real storm had already arrived. Jonah McGraw's boots struck the wooden floor like rolling thunder as he paced near the front door, his sharp jaw tight, his hand hovering close to the Colt .45 resting against his thigh. Across the room, the 5 terrified mail-order brides huddled together near the stage where they'd once stood like cattle on display. Their soft sobs were muffled beneath the pounding of Jonah's heart as he surveyed the scene before him. On one side stood Brock Hensley, the ruthless saloon owner, his face twisted with fury and greed. On the other, his hired guns, 6 of them, leaned casually against tables and walls, their hands resting on their pistols, eyes glinting with anticipation. The tension was so thick that every breath Jonah took felt like drawing a knife across his lungs. "You got no claim to him, McGraw," Brock snarled, breaking the silence. His deep voice carried the arrogance of a man who'd always gotten his way. "You think you can walk in here, kick down my door, and play hero? These women are mine, paid for, fair and square." Jonah's eyes burned like embers beneath the brim of his hat. "They ain't yours," he growled, his voice low and rough like distant thunder. "Ain't nobody's property. And I ain't ridden out of here without 'em." For a brief moment, the saloon fell silent. The piano player, sensing the storm about to break, slipped quietly out the back door. A glass clinked against the bar as one of the hired guns shifted his weight. And somewhere outside, a gust of wind slammed the shutters against the window frames, making the brides flinch. Then Brock laughed. A slow, deep, mocking laugh that crawled through the air like a rattlesnake. "You hear that, boys?" he said, glancing at his men. "Ranch boy thinks he's some kind of savior. Reckon we ought to teach him what happens to heroes round here." Jonah didn't move. His breathing slowed, his fingers twitching ever so slightly near his gun. He knew what was coming, and he was ready. But before the first shot rang out, one of the brides, Clara, the eldest, stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Please," she whispered, her soft southern accent breaking under the weight of desperation. "Don't fight. He's just trying to help us. Please, don't let anyone die tonight." Jonah's gaze flicked to her for just a moment, enough to see the pleading in her tear-bright eyes. It grounded him, steeling his resolve. Brock sneered. "Oh, don't you worry, sweetheart. Ain't nobody dying. 'Cept maybe your cowboy friend here." And with that, the first gunshot cracked like lightning splitting the sky. Jonah dove to the side, rolling across the dusty floor as splinters exploded from the table behind him. He came up on one knee, his Colt drawn, firing 2 quick shots. The first slammed into the lamp overhead, plunging the saloon into near darkness, save for the flicker of lantern light. The second struck one of Brock's hired guns square in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground with a scream. The room erupted into chaos. Glass shattered. Chairs toppled. The bride screamed and ducked behind an overturned table. Jonah moved like a ghost through the saloon, staying low, weaving between shadows as bullets tore through the walls and bar. He counted his shots carefully, 6 rounds, no more. Every pull of the trigger had to matter. One by one, Brock's men dropped, some wounded, some fleeing, none prepared for a man like Jonah McGraw. Years of ranch life, of survival in the wild, had honed his instincts sharper than any blade. He didn't waste a single movement, didn't hesitate. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose but everything worth saving. Finally, the gunfire stopped. Smoke hung thick in the air, stinging Jonah's throat and burning his lungs. The saloon was silent again, save for the labored breathing of the few remaining men. Jonah stood in the center of the room, his boots planted firmly, his Colt still raised. Brock staggered back, his face pale and twisted with rage. He was the last man standing. You just signed your death warrant, McGraw, Brock spat, wiping blood from his split lip. You think this ends tonight? You think tacking them girls away's gonna be easy? Jonah took a slow step forward, his shadow stretching long and dark across the saloon floor. This ends when you let him go, Jonah said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the smoky haze. Else I swear, Brock, it ends with you. For a heartbeat, Brock hesitated. Jonah could see the war playing out in the man's eyes, the stubborn pride against the cold reality of what had just happened. Finally, with a guttural curse, Brock threw his pistol to the floor. They ain't worth dying for, he muttered, shoving past Jonah as he stormed toward the door. But you ain't seen the last of me, cowboy. Jonah didn't move, didn't lower his gun until Brock and his remaining men had vanished into the night. When the silence finally settled, Jonah turned to the 5 women. Their faces were pale, streaked with tears, but there was hope there now. Fragile, flickering thing, like the last light of a dying fire. You're safe now, Jonah said softly, holstering his weapon. But we gotta move. Brock ain't the kind to lick his wounds for long. He'll be back, and next time he won't come alone. Clara nodded, wiping her cheeks as she reached for the youngest bride, a girl no older than 17 who clung to her hand like a lifeline. Where will we go? She whispered, her voice trembling. Jonah glanced toward the door, where the vast, untamed prairie stretched beyond the fading glow of the saloon lanterns. My ranch, he said firmly. It ain't much, but it's safe. And with that, they slipped quietly into the night, leaving behind the smoke, the blood, and the shattered remnants of a place that had nearly been their prison. But Jonah knew this was only the beginning. There in the dark, Brock Hensley would be. The dusty plains of Willow Creek lay quiet under the dimming sky, painted in fading strokes of gold and amber, but inside Sheriff Carter's small office, the silence was heavy with tension. A single lantern flickered on his desk, casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden walls. Samuel Hart stood near the window, his broad shoulders tense beneath his weathered coat, his hat resting on the table beside him. Outside, distant sounds of laughter and music drifted from the saloon, where everything had started. But tonight wasn't about rescuing brides. Tonight was about war, a quiet one, brewing beneath the surface. The 5 mail-order brides sat together on a worn bench, their faces pale but eyes sharp with unspoken questions. Evelyn, the eldest and the most outspoken, broke the silence. Sheriff, she said softly, how long before they come for us? Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Not long, he replied grimly. Colgan Briggs ain't the kind of man who forgets being humiliated, especially not in front of his men. He lost 5 women, a whole night's worth of earnings, and his pride. He'll come at us hard, and he'll come fast. The younger brides exchanged nervous glances. Lila, barely 18, clutched her hands together as if in prayer. But you saved us. He can't just— Oh, he can, Samuel interrupted, his deep voice steady but edged with restrained fury. Briggs runs half this territory. He's got hired guns, bought judges, and enough muscle to take this whole town apart if he wants. The room grew colder. For the first time since Samuel had kicked down the saloon doors and pulled the 5 women from their nightmare, the reality of what they faced sank in. Rescuing them had been the easy part. Keeping them safe? That was going to be hell. Sheriff Carter stood, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. We'll need to get you all out of Willow Creek tonight. Samuel, I'll ride with you. If we can get you past Eagle Ridge, Briggs' men won't follow. It's Apache land beyond there, and even Briggs ain't stupid enough to cross it. But Samuel shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. Running won't fix this, he said. Briggs will keep sending men. Sooner or later, they'll find us. No. If we want peace, we've got to face this now. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You always were the stubborn kind. Stubborn's kept me alive this long, Samuel shot back, turning his gaze to the brides. His voice softened. But I won't risk your lives. Tonight, we move you to my ranch. It's isolated, guarded by canyon walls on 3 sides. Briggs will have to crawl through hell to get there. Evelyn's hand brushed Lila's trembling fingers, offering silent comfort. For the first time, hope flickered in their weary faces. But it was short-lived, because just then, the distant sound of hooves thundered through the night. Samuel's instincts kicked in immediately. He reached for his revolver, his other hand pushing the lantern aside. Lights out, he ordered. Carter doused the flame in a single motion, and the room plunged into darkness. Outside, shadows of riders passed beneath the moonlight, their silhouettes sharp against the glowing horizon. There were at least 10 of them. Briggs' men. Too soon, Carter muttered under his breath. He's moving faster than I thought. Samuel crouched near the window, his eyes scanning the riders as they dismounted outside the saloon across the street. The laughter and music from earlier had died. Now there was only silence, broken by the creak of boots on wooden planks. There. Watching us, Samuel whispered. What do we do? Lila asked, her voice barely audible. We don't give them a reason to shoot. Not yet, Samuel said firmly. Pack light. Only what you can carry on horseback. Evelyn, you ride with me. Sheriff, saddle the others. Within minutes, they slipped out the back door, staying low as they made their way through the narrow alleyways behind the sheriff's office. The brides clung close, skirts brushing against the dusty walls. The sound of their breaths was loud in the stillness, but when they reached the stables, Samuel stopped dead in his tracks. The horses were gone. Damn it, Carter cursed under his breath. Briggs' men must have cut us off. Before Samuel could reply, a slow, mocking clap echoed from the shadows. Out stepped Colton Briggs himself, dressed in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, his gold-toothed grin glinting beneath the moonlight. Well, well, Briggs drawled, his voice dripping with venomous charm. Ain't this something? My missing merchandise. And the fool who stole em. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Briggs and the brides. They're not your property, he said coldly. And you're not tacking them. Back? Briggs chuckled low, but there was no humor in his eyes. You think you're a hero, Hart? You think kicking down my doors makes you a better man? Let me tell you something. This territory runs on money and power, and I've got both. You? You've got a badge that ain't worth the tin it's stamped on and a ranch hung in? On by a thread. Samuel's fingers brushed the handle of his revolver. Carter stepped up beside him, his hand resting on his own holster. For a moment, the air was thick enough to choke on. The brides huddled together behind Samuel, their breaths. Quick and shallow. Briggs finally leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. I'll give you a choice, Hart. Hand over the women. Walk away alive, or... He tilted his head slightly, signaling his men hidden in the shadows. We turn this street into a graveyard. Samuel didn't flinch. You'll have to kill. Me first, he said, his voice like steel. Briggs smiled coldly. Reckon I can manage that. But before a shot could be fired, a voice called out from above. Drop it, Briggs. Everyone froze, looking up toward the rooftops. There, silhouetted against the night sky, were at least a dozen townsfolk, rifles aimed, ready to defend. Among them was old Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith, and Maria Sanchez, who ran the general store. Behind them, more figures emerged from the shadows, forming a silent wall of resistance. Briggs' grin faltered as he realized the trap. "You ain't takin' these women," Jenkins growled. "Not tonight, not ever." For the first time, Briggs hesitated. Samuel stepped forward slowly, his voice calm but deadly. "Leave, Briggs, while you still can." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, until finally Briggs spat on the ground, glaring at Samuel with pure hatred. "This ain't over, Hart," he snarled, retreating into the darkness. "Not by a damn sight." As the hoofbeats faded into the night, Samuel finally exhaled, though his hand never left his gun. The brides collapsed against each other, relief and fear tangled together. Sheriff Carter clapped Samuel on the shoulder. "You just painted a target on your back, friend." Samuel stared into the shadows where Briggs had disappeared, his jaw set like stone. "I know," he murmured, "but some things are worth dying for." The first light of dawn stretched lazily over the Red Creek Valley, painting the sky with hues of gold and rose. Dew glistened on the grass like tiny diamonds, and a cool, crisp breeze carried the sweet scent of wild sage and blooming mesquite through the open plains. The events of the past week, the saloon auction, the gunfight, the rescue already felt like a fading nightmare, yet the echoes of gunfire still lingered in everyone's minds. Inside the modest ranch house, the 5 mail-order brides Clara, Emily, Sarah, Lila, and Grace sat around the rough-hewn pine table, sipping cups of strong, bitter coffee that Thomas had brewed. Their dresses were simple now, the bright, scandalous gowns they'd been forced to wear at the saloon folded away forever, replaced by clean calico and cotton skirts. But no matter how soft the fabric or how free the air smelled, each woman carried a weight inside her heart, a mixture of gratitude, uncertainty, and fragile hope. Thomas Dalton, the once lonely rancher whose life had been a long stretch of silence, walked in from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His boots were dusty, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, and his face bore the familiar expression of quiet strength that had first steadied the frightened brides the night he kicked open the saloon doors. "Fences are fixed," he said simply, setting his hat on the table. "Cattle'll stay put now." Clara smiled faintly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Seems like you fix everything, Mr. Dalton." Thomas paused, his eyes softening. "Not everything," he said quietly. "But I aim to try." There was a moment of silence, the kind where unspoken words hung heavy between people, thick as the morning fog. Then Emily, the youngest of the brides with bright auburn hair and a restless heart, leaned forward on her elbows. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For us, I mean, we don't belong anywhere. We ain't got families waiting back east. We ain't got money. All we've got is each other." Thomas studied her for a long moment before pulling out a chair and sitting down. He rested his forearms on the table, his rough hands clasped together. "You belong here," he said simply, "if you want to stay." Lila blinked at him, her usually sharp tongue momentarily stilled. "You'd let us stay? Just like that?" Thomas nodded. "This ranch is bigger than one man can handle. Always has been. Thought I could manage it alone, but—" He glanced toward the open doorway where the distant mountains caught the rising sun, his voice quiet and steady. "A place like this, it needs laughter. It needs life. It needs people." Grace, the oldest of the brides and the quietest of them all, finally spoke up. Her soft brown eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "Nobody's ever wanted us anywhere before," she whispered. Thomas met her gaze without flinching. "Then, it's about time someone did." A silence followed his words, but it wasn't heavy or sad. It was the kind of silence that came before something new, something better. Outside, the wind stirred the tall prairie grass, and somewhere nearby, a meadowlark began to sing. That afternoon, the work began in earnest. The ranch, once stark and solitary, suddenly pulsed with new energy. Emily helped Thomas mend the corral fences while Sarah learned to saddle a horse for the first time, her laughter ringing across the yard when the spirited bay mare shook her head and stomped her hooves. Clara, whose nimble fingers had once been forced to sew cheap dresses in a back-alley workshop, now stitched curtains for the ranch house windows, brightening the dark rooms with soft blues and creams. Grace tended to a neglected garden behind the house, coaxing new life from dry soil, while Lila, ever bold, ever restless, taught herself to shoot Thomas's old Winchester rifle, just in case danger came riding again. For the first time in years, Thomas heard voices on his land. He heard laughter, soft songs hummed under breaths, and conversations that stretched into the night. The loneliness that had wrapped around his life like a cold, unyielding blanket began to loosen its hold. But not everyone in Red Creek Valley was happy about it. 2 weeks after the saloon raid, Sheriff Coleman rode up to the ranch, his horse kicking up a plume of dust as he dismounted. "Dalton," he called out, his tone half warning, half weary, "you've made yourself a target. That saloon gang? The ones you tangled with? Word is, they've got friends up north. Men meaner than rattlesnakes and twice as ornery." Thomas leaned against the fence, one boot crossed casually over the other. "Let 'em come," he said evenly. "They'll find we're not as defenseless as we look." Behind him, Lila appeared, cradling the Winchester like it belonged in her hands, her expression as sharp as flint. The sheriff's brows rose slightly, and after a moment he chuckled. "Reckon you're not, at that." Spring gave way to summer, and life on the ranch settled into a rhythm. Thomas taught Sarah to ride, and though she fell more than once, she kept getting back up, stubborn as a mule. Emily discovered a knack for training wild colts, and soon even the most skittish mustangs came when she called. Clara baked fresh bread every Sunday, filling the house with the warm, comforting scent of home. Each woman began to bloom in her own way, shedding the scars of what they had endured. The dark memories of the saloon no longer defined them. They were free, truly free, for the first time in years, and somewhere in the midst of it all, something unspoken grew between Thomas and Clara. It was in the way his gaze lingered a moment too long when she laughed, in the way she found excuses to walk beside him when they checked the fences, and in the quiet comfort they shared under the starlit sky. He didn't rush it, didn't speak it aloud. But everyone on the ranch could see it, the beginnings of a love story as wild and steady as the land itself. One evening, as the sun sank low and the prairie glowed like molten gold, the 5 brides stood side by side on the porch, watching Thomas drive the cattle toward the lower pastures. Emily nudged Clara gently, smirking. "You know," she whispered, "if you don't marry that man soon, one of us might beat you to it." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she smiled, her eyes never leaving Thomas's figure in the distance. "Maybe I'm waiting for him to ask." Grace sighed softly, leaning against the porch rail. "Doesn't matter if it's marriage or just this life," she said, her voice full of quiet wonder. "We've got something here we never thought we'd find." Sarah slipped an arm around her waist, nodding. "A home," she said. Simply, the wind carried their laughter across the open land, mixing with the distant call of coyotes and the rustling of cottonwood leaves. For the first time, the Red Creek Ranch wasn't just Thomas Dalton's ranch anymore. It was theirs. Months later, travelers passing through Red Creek whispered tales about a place on the edge of the wild frontier where 5 women had built new lives after being saved from ruin. They spoke of a quiet rancher who had kicked down a saloon door, defied outlaws, and changed the fate of 5 souls forever. But for Thomas and the women, it wasn't about legends or whispers. It was about the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth, the laughter around a shared table, and the peace that came from knowing they were no longer alone. The past still lingered in shadows, but the future stretched wide before them, endless. As the prairie sky, and under that vast, endless expanse, Red Creek Ranch thrived not because of one man's strength, but because 6 lonely souls